action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing and advertising. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chin-wag with. It's like Pokemon Go, with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. It's brought to you by Gasp, and I'm Giles Edwards, co-founder and MD. Today, I've caught Eaon Pritchard. Self-proclaimed advertising douchebag, Eaon has worked as an ad creative and planner for over 20 years, firstly in London and now in Melbourne, Australia. He also lectures, consults and writes regularly for WARC and other ad industry publications. Where Did It All Go Wrong is not the title of Theresa May's memoirs, it is the title of Eaon's spectacular book on advertising. Praise for the book comes in droves, with RGA's head of strategy, Rob Campbell, declaring, "Eaon is funny and insightful. I hate him." Welcome to the show, Eaon.
Thanks, Giles. Thanks for having me. I should point out my first book, because the second one's coming. So
Absolutely. We'll come on to that. Let's limber up with our quickfire questions then. So, Eaon, football or rugby?
Football.
Dance or rave?
Dance.
Print or digital?
Both.
England or Australia?
Oh, that's a hard one, being Scottish. You know what? I've been away for so long that I can say England and not hate myself. So yeah.
Glastonbury or Cannes Festival?
Glastonbury.
Don Draper or Don Corleone?
Oh, Corleone.
Independent or network?
Oh, that's another tough one. I hope my bosses aren't listening. Independent.
I snookered you there, sorry.
Yeah.
Now, your career, like many to be fair, has taken a few detours on its way to Melbourne. So can you start by sharing with us what was your first ever job and what was your first proper job? And if you don't manage to squeeze or even crowbar, I don't care, your global techno house hit into the answer, I'm going to keep repeating the question.
Yeah. Well, that stuff's kind of interesting because that sort of got in the way of kind of me getting into the sort of normal workforce. So I left, I went to art school. I don't know what it's like being a student nowadays. Maybe you have to actually attend lectures or, do work. But at art school in the late 80s, there was less pressure, to do that. So you could do other things. So I got, it was around the time of sort of the emerging acid house scene, although it wasn't called that at the time. But I was really interested in music and everything. I played in bands and stuff. So after leaving art school, got into the sort of nascent emerging club scene, became a DJ, ran club nights, eventually started some record labels, did my own music, had a couple of sort of minor hits on that scene. So really, did that all the way up until I think it was 1996, really, before I actually got a proper job. And then even then, that was a byproduct of that. So when you do record labels, you have to design, well, for younger listeners, this was when music came in big black plastic 12-inch, objects. So labels needed to be designed, covers needed to be designed. So because I'd been the arty one who'd went to art school, it was given to me to do. So I had to figure out how to use an Apple Mac, and so sort of became a graphic designer by accident. And so that was my first proper job, then setting ads for a local newspaper, and then eventually, worked at a little agency in Aberdeen, where I come from, doing sort of internal comms for oil companies and things. And then I moved to London at the end of the 90s. Obviously, the whole sort of .com thing was going off, but you really needed to be in London, to be part of that. So moved there, worked for a company called Open that was part of Sky TV I think it was co-owned by Sky TV, BT, and HSBC Bank. So this was interactive TV. So I don't know if you remember that red button stuff back in the day. And then just sort of blundered into the advertising business that way. Weapon 7, who are kind of still around, I think it's part of BBDO or something in London now. But that was a little sort of indie, very sort of cutting edge indie agency around early days of digital advertising in London. There was only 3 or 4. There was the likes of Poke and Dare, I think, at the time. There was us. So we worked out of a corridor in FCB's building in Newman Street. That was the sort of really formative time. Obviously I came into the industry probably quite late, compared to other people. I didn't have much of a clue about advertising. I knew, I was a kind of designer, so I really got the chops there. And then, did a few other things in London, then ended up out in Australia 9 years ago. Went to BBDO in Melbourne, and and been here ever since. So it was a weird way in, late to the game. Still trying to figure it out, to be honest. But
I think the good ones are.
yeah. I guess inspirations for some of the stuff in there was just was kind of looking around and seeing how little knowledge or history, sense of history, many people have in the business. I was kind of probably, a lot of the people I worked with in the early days, I was in awe of some of them, because of their just their sort of legacy and stuff. There seems to be less of that now. It's almost as if expertise is, there's less respect for that than perhaps, would be optimal.
Yeah, I agree. I think I've heard you refer to the year zero approach before, where everything's treated as if it all started in 2007.
Yeah.
So I think your point's valid. So back to your book though. The title is inspired in part by George Best.
That is correct. Yeah. I mean, it's a fairly well-known story. Well, I guess it seemed like it was to me. Well, it's funny. I mean, I do presentations, around the book in Australia, and of course, people have no idea what I'm talking about. I mean, they have no idea what I'm talking about in general, but specifically about George Best. So so it's probably unsurprising that it sold better in the UK than it did out here. But I mean, the basic George Best story is George, arguably the most talented footballer of his generation, but he ended up retiring the first time from the game at the age of 27, which is really when most players are really at the top of their game. And the story, he was kind of more interested in sort of the company of glamorous Miss World winners and in casinos and drinking and stuff than he was in football. Which is probably reasonable to consider. But the story goes that George was in the hotel above some casino. He he just won, the probably equivalent of about £500,000 on the roulette thing, in the company of either a former or current Miss World. And so after they finished the game, they went up to their room. And apparently they're lying on the bed, covered in money, and a little Irish waiter comes to the door with a magnum of champagne that they'd ordered, and so the little Irish waiter has a look at George, Miss World, all the money, and then I'm not going to do the Irish accent, and he says, "Tell me, George, where did it all go wrong?" So because this was the story of George, was this sort of wasted talent, who'd sort of thrown it all away. But of course, on the surface, to this waiter, it didn't look like much was wrong. But I thought it was an interesting parallel with when you look at the the numbers that are being sort of bandied around about the advertising business and the amount of money. So, there's more money being spent and generated in advertising than at any time, and it's growing. So on the surface, it looks like it's a sort of very positive and vibrant industry. But of course, you scratch below the surface, and you see that, you just need to spend 5 minutes in an agency to know that margins are being squeezed. Salaries have, haven't really increased probably in about 10 years, in some cases going down. So there's a load of money, but where's it all going? There's a sense that, there's a real truth that about 70 cents in every dollar spent in digital is being hoovered up by obviously our friends at Google and Facebook. And fair play to them, they've been better at operating in this sort of system. But even amongst that remaining money, there's so much being hoovered up by fraud, all kinds of nefarious activity, and it just seems like something has gone horribly wrong. I guess I was attempting to not solve the problem, but just point to a few perhaps less obvious areas where we've dropped the ball, and other people have seen a business opportunity, some more legal than others, and have come in and scooped that up. So it's kind of my sort of catchphrase for it was, we've got as an advertising industry, we've got a bit of an identity crisis. I think that in order, it's not insurmountable, but we need to figure out what we are, what purpose we serve, within the economy, and what kind of things do we actually want to make. That's the big challenge. I was a bit worried. Some of these thoughts in the book had been hanging around for a few years, and when I put it out, I thought, I wonder if I'm actually too late, with some of this stuff. But then, it's been out over a year, and every week, there seem to be new stories emerging in the news and things. I think actually, I wasn't late. In many respects, I was early with some of these things. So, sorry, that was a long answer to the first question.
No, we like long answers.
All right.
We like long answers. Well, funny enough, I was going to say actually, Amazon's, I suppose, own algorithm on their authors page suggests that customers who bought your book or your first book also bought items by Bob Hoffman, Byron Sharp, and Richard Shotton. So that's good associated company. But the first of whom, Bob Hoffman, who obviously he goes by Ad Contrarian, I feel he's been talking about certainly the murkiness of and fraud that is sadly rife in digital advertising.
Yeah. Well, I think his not his most recent book, but I think the one he did a couple of years ago, Bad Men. That's probably the definitive document of that particular point of view. It's funny, because you say when my book comes up, it shows other people bought those. I hope that when some of those other books you mentioned, if they came up and if I'm in the recommended thing for that would be more useful to me, because they sell lots more books than I do. But yeah.
Well, it's a good, I think, very complementary group of authors to be amongst.
Yeah, well, it's certainly for somebody like me who doesn't have quite the profile of some of those other people, it's kind of it's good to be included in some small way in that set, but it's also I think on the sort of back cover of my book, I said there's a proto meme that's starting to go critical, so it wasn't, it's kind of been humble-ish in saying these are not necessarily my original thoughts or ideas. It's part of a sort of groundswell, and I think that's fairly, obvious that, and every day there's more people coming around to the idea that we need to sort of rethink some of what we're doing. But the next book, the title of my next book is called "Shot by Both Sides." So that's I kind of nicked that from the Howard Devoto song of the same name. But it's kind of because it's sort of addressing that sort of challenge that we have now. Because I think we've got on the one side, this is not to be disrespectful to Bob Hoffman or others in any way, but whilst I sort of buy into 70-80% of what he says, I think there's just a danger that he and some others, occasionally just go a little bit too far in their anti-digital stance. Because I think it's a fact that it's almost the digital label has almost become kind of nonsensical now, because things that used to be analog are digital. Obviously, most television is now delivered over the internet. Out of home is digital. There's a lot of positive aspects to what the potential of digital technology is. So I think it's wrong to come out on a sort of almost quasi sort of Luddite stance. I think is a mistake. But of course, on the other hand, to go to I think the opposite end of that spectrum is the sort of totally ad tech, martech kind of dismissing creativity and being purely sort of data and algorithm driven. I think that's equally wrong. So I sometimes feel like I'm stuck in the middle in a sort of no man's land, with kind of half a foot in both camps, if you know what I mean.
You talk of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Can you explain what that is and what the point is that you're making about the industry?
Yeah, sure. Well, the Dunning-Kruger effect, again, it's fairly well known in sort of psychology. So there's two American psychologists, David Dunning and Justin Kruger, and they had this. This is the great thing about psychology and science in general, is sometimes great sort of breakthroughs or revelations come from relatively kind of mundane observations, and so they. Despite being very clever scientists, they were big fans of TV shows like America's Got Talent, and they used to watch these, particularly the auditions, and they would see these contestants, that would come that clearly had no talent whatsoever, and in their own heads they sounded like Mariah Carey, but then what came out of their mouths was this hideous sort of cacophony, and they kind of they sort of enjoyed this, and then it became crystallized when there was a story about a bank robber in Pittsburgh, who was a guy called MacArthur Wheeler, and he'd apparently gone and robbed a couple of banks in broad daylight in Pittsburgh. This was in the late 90s, and had been arrested about 2 hours later, but he couldn't believe that the police had actually caught him, because despite the fact that he never disguised himself at all, he'd read somewhere that lemon juice was used in the manufacture of invisible ink. So he rubbed his face with lemon juice before going into the bank, and he'd taken a little sort of selfie, with one of these old Polaroid cameras, where the picture comes out the bottom of the camera. Do you remember those?
Yeah.
And of course, he'd taken his picture and there was a blank wall, and so he was convinced he was invisible, but he just misaimed his shot. So he went in and robbed the banks. And so, these sort of two things came together for Dunning and Kruger, and they sort of came to the conclusion that not only was MacArthur Wheeler too stupid to be a bank robber, but he was too stupid to even recognize his own stupidity. So it's kind of connected to the sort of overconfidence bias, and so what they came to the conclusion that many of us are very, very confident idiots, And so, it's.
Yeah.
I always enjoyed that story, and so I thought
Yeah.
I sort of built that in. I think when you look around, some of the, um, particularly in the advertising press, some of the opinion pieces, well, in fact, most of them, and a lot of the things that get said, and you just, you think these people are very, very confident, yet don't have the first clue what they're really talking about. But just for any listeners who are thinking, who is this arrogant twat? I use the story because it's very much my own story. Because, but I'll tell the story. I mean, this is just maybe 9 or 10 years ago. So I just come out to Australia, and I so this was at BBDO. So I'd been hired there because I was the sort of digital guy, you see. So I was full of all of this, advertising's dead. People want to have conversations with brands, all that kind of stuff. And I really believed all that at the time. And I got wheeled out to one of to the head office of one of our clients, and what I didn't know was this client were one of the early sponsors of the Edinburgh Bath Institute. So that's University of South Australia. So that's the home of Byron Sharp, Rachel Kennedy, people like that. I knew nothing about any of that. You see, so I went out to this client, gave a big spiel about how you need to stop, spending money on ancient technologies like TV, and everything's got to be social and blah blah blah. And of course, there's about 200 of these brand managers all sitting looking at me like with these blank expressions on their faces, and I was like, what's wrong with these people? And of course, at the end, one sort of kindly brand manager pulled me to one side and said, Eaon, this is all very entertaining and all that, but you will get nowhere with these people talking like that. And I was like, but why? The sky is falling, all that kind of stuff. So this had been 2010, so I reckon that it was kind of hot off the press or hadn't been out very long. She gave me the Byron Sharp book, How Brands Grow. And she said, read that book, understand that book, and don't come back out here until you do. And so I took it away and I read it over the course of a year, probably a couple of times, still in denial. But then, eventually the penny dropped, and I thought, and so this was my Dunning-Kruger peak, right? Which is you can plot it on a sort of graph, and it's where you're at the absolute peak of stupidity. However, that corresponds with the peak of your confidence in your own stupidity, of course. So,
Yeah.
and so eventually, so after about a year, I thought, Jesus, I've had a reasonable career, for the last 7 or 8 years, despite not having a clue what I'm talking about and being completely wrong about everything. And so that was quite a moment. So so when I when in the book and things, you talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's not me being some sort of pompous kind of buffoon. It's really I'm telling my own story, so that hopefully other people who come across that might sort of benefit from that and think and really just challenge your own assumptions about things. What is the evidence for what you're saying? Because if it's just some bollocks that you've read in Forbes, then unfortunately that doesn't really count. So that was a big moment, really, for me, and a humbling sort of moment. And so I just my hope is more people will have those types of revelations, I guess.
Is the opposite also true? You think of the wise man doubting himself.
Well, that's it. There's a thing. So the I borrowed the sort of graph of the Dunning-Kruger peak. It actually comes from, it's something that photographers use. They call it the Dunning-Kruger peak of photography. Because in that situation, you'll be familiar with the phrase "all the gear and no idea." So this is common in photography circles, and so they've called the sort of opposite of the Dunning-Kruger peak is what they call the Jon Snow trough. And I've never seen Game of Thrones, but apparently that's a Game of Thrones reference. But you would probably, using sort of psychology sort of terminology, you would define that more as the sort of what they call imposter syndrome, which is the opposite of confident idiot, which is where you actually do have quite a lot of skills, but don't recognize them in yourself. So it's kind of waking up every morning and going, when am I going to get found out? So that's probably just as unhealthy. So I guess it's trying to strike the balance.
Yeah, what hope is there for any of us?
Yeah.
And why do you think that is the case? Obviously, the Dunning-Kruger effect plays a part, but is there anything else at play here? I mean, does it coincide with the emergence of new medias and new things, which has then enabled people to claim, almost full ownership and expertise of things without having that historic knowledge to back it up?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's human nature, right? So, good luck in fighting against that. But thinking about advertising in particular, one of the things that's happened, obviously with, since the sort of dawn of the internet, particularly social media, is just the amount of information that's available that instead of having to actually sort of study or it's all far too easily available, and it's the loudest point of view that gets attention. So I think, but it's just so easy to come across pseudo profound bullshit that kind of that can be used, rather than do the hard work and really get to the bottom of things. So I think when there's easily available information that sounds plausible, if you're and I get, you don't want to put too much sort of blame on people, but there's so much pressure to get things done quickly, get to solutions quickly, that it's easier to skip doing proper research, or at least finding proper research. So it's the advertising industry equivalent of fake news, or what have you.
I think there's certainly a want to formulate what works and resell that because it makes life easier. And again, I think that's clearly a human instinct to take the path of least resistance.
Yeah, so many popular ideas are not really grounded in any kind of evidence, or partly I think again, this is where we let down the next generation a little bit, is not giving them the proper training. I mean, if you look at I'll give you an example. I mean, just a few weeks ago, I was in a session, right, with a bunch of young planners, and they were. I was sort of helping to sort of mentor this kind of program, and I brought up the, because I said I still keep a copy of the JWT planning guide from 1974. I still keep a copy of that in my desk drawer. I said, because there's not one word of that document that has dated, right? It's still, everything's still relevant, and not only was so there was no dispute to my claim there, because nobody even knew what that document was. They'd never heard of it, and so I think so if we've got young people coming in, they've been let down by their senior people, but if they haven't been given some of these key texts to understand, so.
I'm so pleased you brought that up, Eaon, because I've been wanting to talk about that guide for I think the last 2 or 3 episodes of the podcast, and it hasn't naturally come up. But equally, we've had that transcribed and reprinted here at Gasp, and everybody has a copy. We share it with everyone within the agency, we share it with clients. It's because I couldn't agree more with you. It's absolutely fantastic and timeless.
Yeah. Oh, you'll have to if you've had it transcribed, you'll have to give me a copy, because the one I've got is the scabby PDF, that, the one that everyone's got, which you can't copy and paste out of it because it's a photograph. Although it's quite, so when I give it to people and I say, read that, understand that, and then of course they can't copy and paste out of it, so they're forced to actually type it out themselves. So I'm sure I'm not a real psychologist, but I'm sure they would tell you that learning, by going through the process of actually, writing things down yourself, I think the learning happens at a deeper level. But it is, it's such a great, document. I mean, the whole, so I think it was written in '74, so it probably wasn't written by King himself.
It
Was it?
It was Stephen King.
All right,
Yeah.
okay, because it was mid '60s when they sort of came up with the idea. I love the story about that. Because you had Jeremy Bullmore. He tells the story of being at JWT in the '60s, and they had an office in Berkeley Square or something, or Grosvenor Square, one of these posh squares in West London. And he says, this is not related to this Stephen King, but it's a great story. He said that he was a copywriter by trade before he became chairman and whatever. But he said that they were pulling an all-nighter one night, and because so obviously JWT was very, very posh, so you almost didn't get in there unless you had a double-barreled name, and he said they were pulling an all-nighter, and so it was about 5 a.m, and they just finished up, and they were looking out the square, and then all these horse and carriage things came clip-clopping around the square, and somebody said to Bullmore, "Oh, the suits are up early this morning," But that's how posh it was. So you got JWT, posh land over there, West London, inventing account planning, and then almost at exactly the same time, you've got it was. This is the interesting thing. I think Stanley Pollitt was originally at an agency called it was Pritchard and something Partners. I can't remember what the second name was, but that eventually became BMP, and so Pollitt was the BMP, and they sort of invented it at the same time. But they were over in Paddington, which was much more sort of working class, and one of their big clients was the British Labour Party at the time. So it was this funny sort of cross-class, cross-city sort of thing that happened at the same time. So you got the very posh JWT and then the working class BMP, and then they both come up with one of the great ideas of advertising, almost simultaneously. I mean, coming back to the Ehrenberg Bass thing, I guess interesting thing for me, because I came into this really through being a designer, then a creative director, and then came to sort of planning later on. So I didn't have any of that formal training in market research, or I didn't have a research background at all, which was actually turned out to be useful because I didn't have to unlearn any sort of bad stuff. So really my introduction to really working with statistics and everything was through first through the Byron Sharp book, and then going back and finding the original Andrew Ehrenberg stuff on data reduction and things like that. So the point is, there's no excuse, right? Because that material is all sort of available for people to get. So even though I've said we've let a generation down by not giving them proper training. Of course, I never had proper training, but I had that sort of moment where I realized I didn't have a clue what I was talking about, and so then I had to go back and sort of train myself. So it can be done, but I guess you need to want it to happen.
And I suppose you need time to acknowledge that you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you do come in.
Yeah.
And it's that increase of knowledge which I'm sure is actually, a wiser man will explain, is actually all part of that Dunning-Kruger effect, where you go from knowing zero to knowing one
Yeah,
thing. You feel like you've become empowered with so much knowledge when realistically there's dozens and dozens of other things to learn.
that's it.
But relative to where you've come from, you feel like you're an expert.
Yeah, well, that's right. And if you don't expose to yourself to, or get exposed to people who know a hell of a lot more than you, then the longer it takes, for you to realize that how little you know. I love I mean, this is funny, because with Netflix and all that kind of stuff, you think, oh, this has totally revolutionized TV viewing, but it kind of hasn't. Back in the day, you would just watch whatever was on. Uh, but I find myself with Netflix now, just watching stuff that I would never. I'm not really interested in, but it's just there. And uh, so, well, this was a little while ago. But you never know. You do watch some kind of terrible thing, and then you find something useful in it. I was watching one of the Pink Panther films, so not even the original Pink Panther. It was the remakes with Steve Martin. So it was the remake, the Pink Panther remake, Pink Panther 2. It's a hideous, awful movie, but there's a great line in it when so basically Steve Martin is Inspector Clouseau, and his detective minds from Europe have all been gathered together in France somewhere because they're going to get together and find this notorious jewel thief, right? And there's someone else is joining the group. It's this crime writer called Sonia something or other, played by a big Bollywood actress. She comes in and Clouseau says, "Welcome, Sonia. Let me get you up to speed with the investigation. We know nothing. You are now up to speed." You know, so so I kind of use that, a lot of the time. I say, on the one hand, you've got this Dunning-Kruger effect, and then and what have you. But even those, who know something, all we know is a teeny little bit more than nothing. Uh, and just sort of try and keep that in mind, um, and it stops you getting overconfident.
Yeah.
Easier said.
I mean, other than marketers lacking training, which I think you're spot on, how else can we fix marketing? I just think that there's a line in your book that I'd like to have engraved on our office walls, which is, rather than engagement, conversations, or participation, people's actual buying behavior is about reducing complexity, reducing choice, and making easier, good enough decisions.
Yeah,
And I think when you say it out loud, it's so freaking obvious, but that's true of so much that is right with
yeah,
marketing and yet wrong with how it's being
yeah.
practiced.
Well, I mean, those are the kind of things. So, I mean, those kind of notions don't really get taught even in marketing uh, courses or what have you. Because there's so much marketing theory that can get taught. I mean, there's wrong theory as well. Quite often, I'll get asked recommendation. People say, "Well, what sort of advertising and marketing books would you recommend?" But I tend to say to people, don't really read about marketing and advertising. Read about other stuff. Read about human psychology or philosophy. Read novels about particularly historical novels or about things. You will get more insight from reading. I mean, I say read novels. I actually can't really read novels. I fall asleep. I sort of read. I like to read factual stuff, but
Yeah, same. Yeah.
don't do as I do as I say. But I think because a statement like that one that you just read out, that comes from understanding a bit about human psychology. There are so many things, you know. I mean, it's a little bit of a cliche now to talk about the attention economy, right? But I mean, it's not really a cliche because more and more, human attention is finite. We've only got so much to go around. We don't even have enough to give the appropriate attention to things that actually matter. Like
Mm.
our own families, for instance. So to expect people to give disproportionate attention to things like brands is just ludicrous. And so any tiny bit of attention that you get is really needs to be hard fought, because it's got to be taken away from something else, and it's got to be taken away from something else that is probably more important. There's an interesting trend. I don't know if it's quite a trend yet, but you're sort of hearing about it. People are getting rid of smartphones, altogether, or deleting social apps from their phones just because you just haven't got enough attention to give to all these things. And the likes of Facebook and everything, they're very, very good at they've got armies of psychologists in the background there continually working away, like what are the little things that are going to distract. But of course, the other thing, obviously read about psychology, because one of the most misunderstood things, particularly in advertising, because there's so much talk about emotional response and all that kind of stuff. People have no idea, even basically, how the mind actually works. And so they say, we want an emotional response from this campaign. It's like, well, but what kind of emotion, and which parts of the mind are you trying to sort of attract, because the mind's made up of, it's not one general purpose mechanism. It's lots and lots of specialized mechanisms. And so when you get someone's attention, what you're really doing is drawing one of those mental modules attention, uh, to the thing. And I could go on for hours about that, but just sort of these are the kind of things. We're in the business of trying to get people to do something. And so you need to have at least a cursory kind of understanding of what mechanisms within a person you're trying to move, and how that's going to happen, rather than these silly sort of emotional, rational dichotomies. All decisions are rational. It's just they were rational in an environment far different to the one we live in now, where our minds were formed. Um,
I think you're absolutely right though in terms of people's attention. They don't have time for the things that matter. But technology, if anything, and ad tech has increasingly become more and more intrusive and therefore is less reliant on earning your attention.
yeah,
It seems to be more around how we can efficiently target or efficiently get an ad or a piece of communication in front of the right person's eye, and less focus on how do we make that piece of communication worthy of that person's attention.
yeah, that's it. Because you read uh, sort of how viewability is quantified. So 50% of pixels on screen for a second or something, counts as a view.
Mm.
But it's just sort of really a silly way to measure anything, because it doesn't measure attention. Karen Nelson Field, I heard her talk just recently. It was quite interesting, where they'd done some experiments looking at, basically in the nutshell, it was size matters, right? So, the bigger the screen and the greater the amount of pixels that the ad covers on that screen correlates, directly with likeliness of it being effective. Obviously, you've got to factor in, whether it's creative or all that kind of stuff. So, but this is the challenge. So, in theory, a 56-inch TV with 100% of the pixels covered with your ad is more effective, and that's a fact. But if people are not looking at the TV, as increasingly, despite the TV lobby, will say that TV is just as effective as it ever was. I'm skeptical of that. I don't think it's dead by a long way, but we need to prepare for a time when it just doesn't really work that way anymore. And whether obviously with people are using more and more streaming services that are not ad supported. Now those streaming services are going to need to raise money in some way, because they're going to run out of
Yeah.
capital, and so advertising will come into that environment, but whether it'll be in the form of 15 and 30-second spots, I doubt. So it's going to probably mean more integration with the actual content. Now, I guess the historical way to think about that is product placement. So that's a fairly blunt instrument, So I think, creatively, it'd be good if our creative people are thinking about ways that brands are going to be integrated into the actual entertainment in different ways that hasn't been done before. I think that's the big challenge, because if you can do that, then you get the benefit, all of the benefit of that 100% of the pixels on a huge screen and 100% viewability and attention. So on the one hand, there's possibly quite a bright future for TV advertising, but it just won't be in the form that we're accustomed to.
No, well, certainly not exclusively. There might be, as you say, variants
Yeah,
of having that paid for.
yeah,
Your point around the definition of an impression, so 50% of the pixels visible for at least a second, is a good area to discuss, or at least touch on briefly, because there was a time where Facebook, who they're a law unto themselves in many ways, they were defining an impression as above 0 pixels visible for above 0 seconds.
yeah,
So without that universal measure, it makes it very hard to understand what value you're getting
yeah.
from the very ambiguous analytics that we get.
My sense is not really to pay too much attention to anything that any particular vendor says about their own product, and really
Mm.
look for independent sort of analysis. Of course, without going, this is Bob Hoffman territory, but because the whole all the digital measurement is such a murky world where you just don't know what really to believe. So a friend of mine, Don Marty, who's Mozilla in San Francisco, he was over here last year. We presented at a conference together, but he spent a few days in the office here working with me, and it was just because obviously he's deep in the browser uh, end of technology and everything, and the stuff that he told me, about it really broadened my understanding of the scale of fraud, malware, just the mechanisms for generating impressions, with domain spoofing and mobile apps and everything. It's unfathomable how large this operation is, and also how easy it is for any kid with rudimentary programming skills and a bunch of smartphones can start their own sort of click farm or anything in their back bedroom, and the industry just has no idea, particularly and bodies that are supposed to represent the industry, how they can legislate or anything about things they fundamentally do not understand, both in the scale and actually how uh, it goes well. You can't out hack a hacker. That's the first thing. And so I don't know. I don't have solutions. But I think to turn a blind eye or bury our heads in the sand, and you can see now. So this is sort of dragging down into doom and gloom now, but you can start to see the television industry making the same mistakes as the digital publishers did in allowing. Um, so there's a guy, I can't remember his actual name, but he's on Twitter. He's a good guy to follow called Ad Fraud Researcher. He's just basically he's like the news feed for everything that's going on in ad fraud. It's a good one to follow just to get a picture of of everything that's going on, and you can see like the with programmatic or addressable TV, all the same mistakes that the digital publishing industry made 7 or 8 or 10 years ago. you can see them coming in that OTT space. So I don't know, you know, so just it's another fine mess you got us into. So, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's a thing to keep an eye on, because there's so much money being sucked out of the industry, and it would be if it's going to be preventable, first of all, people need to really pay attention to what's and understand what's actually going on. Anyway, let's talk about something positive.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've had. I'd like to put a couple of listener questions to
All
you,
right, cool.
if we may. We've had a few in, but we've weeded them down to two. So Jack Davies, he quotes a line from an article of yours from 2015.
Oh,
We've forgotten that brand advertising creates demand and direct response fulfills
yeah.
it. And Jack asks, have we remembered yet?
No, I don't think so.
No.
So, although, I guess, in recent years, I think Les Binet and Peter Field have been instrumental in bringing that short-term versus long-term conversation further into the general. So I hear that sort of spoken about a little bit more. So, maybe in lip service. Anyway, that's starting to come back in. But it's not even an ideological question. It's just a factual question. Direct marketers knew this a long time ago. I mean, I've worked at direct marketing agencies. It used to be the mantra was, our job, our job is to make the phone ring. That was before the internet. But our job was to get the click or get the inquiry. So the above the line advertising, got it into people's heads, and our job was to then make it easy to act. And in direct marketing, you're dealing with a smaller pool, because you need to reach everyone in order for the small group that are ready to buy at any given time to do something. But there was never any, there never used to be any debate over that. There were distinct roles for different types of comms. But I think a couple of things that have happened is obviously as more and more of what we do has become technology dependent. Of course, more that technology needs to be made by engineers and all that kind of stuff. They don't understand the actual, the chain of how advertising works, what happens at what point, and because certain things seem to get clicks, then it's like, right, well, or some kind of action, then there's more and more investment goes into those activities that seem to generate the short term effect to the detriment of things. There's a great little story. I think this is probably urban myth, but it illustrates a point, so we'll forgive it if it's not 100% true.
Don't let truth get in the way of a good story, Ian.
Exactly. No, there used to be a little ad used to run on Scottish TV. I remember it when I was a kid, and it seemed to be on for like 10 years, right? The same ad, and it was for Knorr stock cubes, right? And so it was a little Scottish ad. So it was these two guys in a car driving to work on a building site or whatever it was, and every day the guy had his little flask of soup, and every day it was chicken soup. And then one day, he pulls his flask out, and the guy driving said, "That'll be the chicken soup," and he says, "No, this will be the pea and ham." And then the joke was pea and ham from a chicken, but that same ad, right, run every, like once a week, every week for about 10 years, right, and nobody got fed up of it, right. But there was that constant priming, with the funny joke that you didn't get fed up of because it was funny, and it was the same one every time, and that was pretty much all they ever did,
Mm.
and yet, it was still sort of number one or two in that category. So they didn't. There was no. I can't even, I don't know what my point of that was, other than it's a funny story. But it's there was nothing. I guess that's one of those things that was continually effective for years and years and years. There was nothing particularly measurable about it. All that you know was that a load of people saw that quite close to the
Yeah.
weekend, and when they went shopping, they bought more stock cubes. So the obsession with attribution, particularly, and we've got all these kind of newfangled things like market mix modeling and econometrics and all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure what really that contributes, other than lots of kind of sciencey looking charts.
And you're still talking about that ad now.
Yeah, yeah, and like every time you go in the supermarket and pick up a can of beans, right, or Heinz beans, right, what goes around in your head?
Beans mean signs, yeah.
Beans means Heinz. Now they probably haven't run that campaign for about 15 years, but
Yeah.
it still goes around in your head, you know, when you do it. So that, I guess, the point is, to the things that are proven, to sell and to build brands, that is creativity, something memorable, being something that kind of has some relevance to people's lives in general. It doesn't need to be personally relevant, but if it's easy to think of, it's all the all of that sort of mental availability type stuff, and then and just being able to buy it.
Well, that's chicken stock adverts is a brilliant example of something that just makes you smile, which sounds really
Yeah,
wanky, but we're talking about it now, and I wasn't familiar with that joke, but I can imagine that I wouldn't tire of that joke easily. So I think hats off, firstly, to the client for allowing that to run for so long.
there is another little urban myth about that apparently they just forgot about it, and so nobody cancelled the booking. So it just ran. So it was more by accident than design. But
I don't know if I want that to be
yeah,
true or not, but either way, it's a good
yeah.
story. Our second question from Mark Walters. He's asks, what can we do to fix programmatic?
Um,
So I think we have to assume that we all agree that something's
yeah,
broken there, but
yeah. I'm going to sort of disagree with that. So programmatic is just pipes, right? It's just a delivery mechanism, and there's probably nothing particularly wrong. It's something, still in the early stages. It'll develop. It'll become more sophisticated. Um, but it's a bit like saying, what's wrong? How do we fix the tap because there's dirty water coming out?
mm,
Right? It's nothing to do with the tap. It's to do with what's going into the water. And so, for all the things that we've talked about, I think industry bodies, uh, just individual agencies or planners, or anyone, just need to look more carefully at what they're proposing, what they're buying, what the solutions are. Does it seem transparent? Do I understand everything about what this particular vendor is providing? Can I be confident that it's going to go in places where people can see it, where the money that the advertiser spends is going to or as much to the publisher, or the going to be carrying the advertising, those kind of things. So it's nothing to do with programmatic as a mechanism. That's just an automation, which, if it's used properly, should actually be better than, and certainly more beneficial for humans, because then people can spend their time actually thinking about uh, planning and stuff, rather than pumping things into spreadsheets. So I think automation is a positive, and there's nothing broken about programmatic. It's what's going down those pipes and where it's ending up. That's the problem.
yeah, that makes sense. Now we come to the final part of the interview, which is our 4 pertinent posers we like to put to all of our
Okay.
guests. So, number 1, Ian, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Um, I came into the industry sort of quite late, and so the mistakes that I made are things that probably would have been better excused if a younger person had done it. So if I was talking to my younger self, it would be, get your shit together, stop dicking around, and get things done quicker. I'd be, 'cause
So, get in
yeah,
early.
yeah, make mistakes early. when there's less at stake.
Yeah, I suppose you can get away with it when you look fresher
Yeah,
faced.
yeah.
Not to say your face isn't fresh, Ian.
I can tell you, it's less than fresh. Yeah, particularly at this time in the morning. You know. Yeah, I've got a bit of a cold. We've got this funny weather in Melbourne, right? It's coming into autumn, so like 1 minute it's freezing, and then the next minute it decides to be 30 degrees again. It can't make up its mind.
Yeah, that would play havoc with me.
Yeah.
So number two, if you could banish one thing from the industry, what would it be and why?
It would banish one thing from the industry. I think I'd probably remove people's internet access for sort of 7 hours of the day, and force them to go and to actually sort of read books or write things down, have their own thoughts, draw things on walls, go out and talk to people, go into supermarkets, watch what people do. Um, the biggest curse is the sort of Google planning, where it's I need to solve a problem, so I'll just go and you know this is I mean, we talked about this earlier. This is a big factor in that sort of Dunning-Kruger effect, because if you don't have to engage your own mind, it's very easy just to pick up bad information because it's there at your fingertips. So
Yeah, I think getting out, talking to people, and actually watching people shop,
yeah,
etc., is brilliant advice,
yeah,
and that's true of I think every marketer, regardless of where they're based. There's a stat that I don't remember the precise figures, but it's relevant nonetheless. But I believe it's in the UK at least 80% of marketers live and work in London, but 80% of consumers don't, and I think that's caused a problem, to put it
yeah, yeah.
simply.
I kind of, I sort of buy that, to a degree, although I'm not sure how. Uh, you know, le- uh, if you said, well, they all lived in, Kensington or something, then yeah. But obviously, there's parts of London that are fairly representative of just about anywhere else, um, in the UK. So,
Mm.
it's a little bit of a, when you get into that representation thing, it can be a bit of a rabbit hole when you start
Mm.
talking about quotas. It's like, well, hang on a minute, we've 100 people here and we've only got 3 northerners. It's I'm not sure how useful that is, but I do think, I mean, maybe coming back to the previous question, for instance, in my sort of normal life, I don't socialize with advertising people. None of my friends work in the industry. They all do, other jobs, you know, everything from, driving a truck, or one guy's a CFO at a biometrics company, so it's kind of, in your life, it's more about getting out of the job bubble when you're just doing your ordinary life. And that's harder for the younger ones, because their social life revolves around, uh, people that they work with, so I mean, I don't know how you solve that. Maybe
Mm.
we set up sort of weekend care centers, right, where we send young advertising people to go and sort of hang out with people that work in shops or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's definitely some wisdom
yeah,
there. Now, I'm wary that you talked about or recommended people avoid books
yeah.
on marketing. So, our third question is any books that you would recommend. So, just to stress, that can be completely outside of marketing.
Many, many, many things. I mean, I've got, one of my favorite writers just now is, a guy called Mats Alvesson, who's a Swedish organizational economist or something. So he's written a few books. One in particular called "The Triumph of Emptiness," which is
Mhm.
fantastic. He also co-authored a book called "The Stupidity Paradox" with a guy called Andre Spicer, who's an economics professor in London. Spicer's done his own book, "Business Bullshit," which is hilarious. So that's a little sort of trilogy that I sort of dip in and out of. I like Daniel Dennett, the philosopher. There's Intuition Pumps, great one for planners because it's all thinking tools. So that's a good one. So and I read a lot of psychology. I'm actually into sort of textbooks at the moment. So I've got one, the Cosmides and 2B, that they sort of edited, called The Adapted Mind. So evolutionary basis of culture. So that's it's full of like academic papers by other psychologists and anthropologists, but you can go down all kinds of rabbit holes. So I think getting one or two good textbooks is good because you can just go into the sort of bibliographies and the references and find all kinds of things. So whether it's psychology or philosophy or things like that. So anyway, that's a few. Um,
Yeah, great. We'll link to all of those on this episode's listing, so everyone can check those out. And then lastly, we always dedicate every show to someone, and we bestow or hospital pass that honour, depending on your point of view, to our guest, who also has to give their reason why. So over to you, Eaon.
So I talked earlier on. So when I sort of decided that this is kind of the path I wanted to pursue, I think was when I was at Weapon 7 in London. So the guy, he'll probably cringe with embarrassment if he hears this, but so Mark Brown was one of the partners there, and was a very well known, almost legendary planner, I think, in London in the 90s. He'd been at Leo Burnett and places like that. So, but Mark, he didn't really teach me much, but it was more just observing just his sort of behavior, how he sort of went about himself, the thoroughness. He was a great researcher. And when I joined Weapon 7, I'd went there. Mark took me down. There was a pub around the corner on Charlotte Street, down in a basement, I think. I went down there, and he said to me, Ian, this is why we're here. We want to completely revolutionize the world of advertising. I was sold. I was like, well, when do I start? Because that sounds like, I've no idea what that means, but it sounds pretty exciting. So I would credit or blame, depending on what you want. Mark Brown probably for anything that I've achieved. So.
Fantastic. So as a final call to action, please, everyone, if you've enjoyed this episode, if you head over to the podcast homepage, we've shared links to some of Ian's brilliant articles, links to the book recommendations we've just discussed, and everything else referenced in the last hour. And how else can they get more of you in their lives, Ian? Any upcoming events to reference?
Well, the next book, which is called Shot by Both Sides, What We Have Here is a Failure to Communicate, that will be out, I'm thinking probably about July. So it's kind of done. There's bits of editing and stuff going on just now. So however long that takes, and then it goes through the mincer, but that'll be out this year sometime. Obviously, you can buy the first one on Amazon and other online book places. I'm on Twitter, so it's Eaon Eaonp on Twitter. Follow me there. There's I'm in that Eat Your Greens book as well, so that's been huge. I want to do more speaking stuff, but it's proving hard. One, because I established the rule that I wasn't going to speak anywhere unless I got paid, so that sort of put an end to that. But plus being in Australia, even if people want to pay your expenses, then it's a big expense to fly someone out from here. So I don't know, but if there's any sort of rich conference organisers listening and they want an international best-selling author to speak, then I'm available for that.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us, Ian. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk.
Thank you for having me. Hopefully hopefully that was okay.
It was
All right,
great.
cool.
So thank you to everyone who's willingly let their ears be bent by us
Yeah.
for the last hour or so. If you want to get in touch with the show and have your questions answered in upcoming episodes, please email us direct at hello@calltoaction.co.
I can't get no call to action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.